Greetings all, Ferrariman601 here. You may be wondering why there is a strange box on your screen surrounded by some red circles with a big blue circle in the middle. Well, direct your attention to said box because that box is a car. Today, in the 6th installment of the Sim Racing 101 series, we are talking about weight transfer, what it is, and why it's important in the pursuit of the almighty lap time. This box represents a car. Now, most cars are four-wheeled vehicles. Yes, we've had some pretty cool exceptions throughout the years, but 99.9% of all cars produced in the world are four-wheeled vehicles. Those four wheels are represented by the red ovals you can see drawn around each corner of this box. In the center of the box, you see a large blue circle. This circle represents our center of gravity. This is the center of gravity, center of mass, the highest concentration of overall weight in a vehicle. Optimally, when it comes to car setup, designers, engineers, and drivers alike all try to pursue a 50-50 weight distribution. This means relative to front and rear, the weight is centered in exactly the midpoint of the chassis between the front and rear axles. That is what this picture is representing. That blue circle is our center of mass. You can see as it is in the middle of this rectangle that there would be an equal amount of force by weight exerted on the front and rear axles. This situation, assuming that a car does have perfect weight distribution, which is very difficult to achieve in the real world, but everybody goes after it, this situation is what you would expect to see if a car is at rest or not under any sort of acceleration traveling at a constant speed. That center of mass is at a 50-50 point directly in the middle of the chassis relative to the front and rear wheels. This is ideal weight distribution. This is ideal balance, because what this does is it allows the tires to work effectively on the front and rear in generating traction, and then of course using that traction to affect the vehicle's pitch, roll, and cornering, of course through acceleration and braking as well in pitch and roll on the circuit. So, when the center of mass is in the middle, the vehicle is working most effectively, and this is what everything attempts to return to as its state of rest in this overall system. And now in this next shot, what we see is something very different. This is a situation that occurs usually when a vehicle is under acceleration. Relative to the front and rear, the center of mass, that blue dot, has now moved rearward. What this means is we have applied an accelerative force in a forward vector relative to our last position of rest, and the vehicle is now increasing in its speed in a straight ahead direction. You may notice, whether you're in a car in the real world or you're in a sim situation, you will notice that certain cars, very many cars actually, under heavy acceleration, the nose lifts. The reason why the nose lifts is because there has been a weight transfer relative to the rear axle toward the rear axle. There is now less force acting on the nose of the car and more force acting on the rear. This is actually quite intuitive to understand, and anybody who has ever been in a vehicle of any sort has felt that sensation of being pushed back in your seat. Your arms get slightly heavier, your head gets slightly heavier, everything wants to pull you rearward as you start to accelerate. This is what is happening. Our center of mass has shifted rearward. We're simply traveling in a straight line here. We are not cornering, we are not braking, we are only accelerating straight ahead. Our center of mass has shifted over the rear axle. For this reason, many cars, particularly very fast ones, have larger tires on the rear. They have larger tires so that when the car accelerates and more weight is pressed down onto the rear axle, there is more grip generated by more rubber surface, more contact patch on the road, so that when the weight shifts rearward, the tires can take advantage of that and generate even more grip and have more capacity of applying their tractive effort to the road surface to aid in acceleration. Formula One has recently made this change. We've been complaining for the last few years about how the rear tires in particular on Formula One cars are very narrow. For 2017, they are going to be about 35-40% wider When that weight transfers over to the rear under acceleration, Formula One cars are now going to have more traction because of those wider tires, and obviously the weight transfer is occurring. So that's acceleration. And now in this shot, what we see is the exact opposite. We are still looking at acceleration here for all of you physics nuts out there, but we are undergoing negative acceleration. We are now applying an accelerative force in the opposite vector as we did on the previous slide. So for us car nuts, this is braking. We are now slowing our forward speed, and we are applying the brakes and slowing down. You'll notice that opposite to acceleration, under braking, the center of mass has now shifted from the rear axle to the front axle. Again, those of you who have been in a car in the real world or have sim experience will know that under heavy braking, the nose of the car will dip down toward the road surface. This is because braking induces a weight transfer toward the front axle, so the weight shifts forward under braking. If you've been in a car in the real world, you understand that under braking, opposite to the forces that you feel under acceleration where you're pushed back in your seat, braking will push you forward in your seat. And the reason for this is we have to consult Newton's laws of motion. An object at rest tends to stay at rest unless it is acted upon by an external force. The same is true for an object in motion. So, you, the car, and everything in the car, once it is traveling at whatever rate of speed you like, it wants to continue traveling at that same rate and vector, that same direction, no matter what. When we brake, we are applying an external force to that mass. But because that law of motion is such that everything just wants to continue maintaining its current vector, there's going to be a reaction occurring when we apply that external force. For this reason, you move forward in your seat when the brakes apply, and the center of mass of the car also moves forward to the front axle, simply because it wants to continue maintaining its current vector no matter what. So that's why braking induces a forward weight transfer. We have now begun to decelerate, and the center of mass has shifted forward, now over the front axle. So now we return to our 50-50 picture from before. Before we said that this 50-50 shot was at rest, and yes, it certainly could be at rest. However, let's also assume for this point that the vehicle is now traveling in a straight line at a constant speed. An object in motion tends to stay in motion unless acted upon by an external force. So, for argument's sake, this car is now traveling at 50 miles per hour. It's not accelerating, it is not braking, and it is not turning. We are simply traveling in a perfectly straight line, assuming no friction, assuming no losses at all in this system. So you'll notice the center of mass has now returned to the middle, back to our 50-50 point from before. This will continue infinitely until an external force is applied to the car. In the real world, of course, we have energy losses through air resistance, through friction, friction with the road surface on the tires, friction in the engine, small energy losses in that regard, which require a little bit of extra force to be applied all the time to maintain the car's speed and direction. However, assuming a perfect world with no friction and no air resistance, this situation would continue forever. However, in the real world, we have to turn, and of course, in sim racing, turning is a very important component of getting lap time. So, what happens in a corner? So, in this slide, we can see what happens when we enter a right turn. You will notice that although we are turning right, the center of mass of this car has shifted to the left. We are assuming no other accelerative forces are being applied, so we are maintaining a constant speed around a constant radius right-hand corner. The center of gravity has shifted over to the left. Notice that it is still pretty much in the center relative to the front and rear axles, but relative to the actual center point of the chassis, it has shifted over to the left. This is an artifact of centrifugal force. Whenever we turn in a given direction, our mass shifts in the opposite direction because the vehicle always wants to continue on a straight path as it had before. An object in motion tends to stay in motion. So we're applying an external force attempting to get this vehicle to move around a right-hand corner. It wants to go straight, however, we are forcing it to the right, hence the center of mass wants to continue in its original straight trajectory, which is why it has now shifted over to the opposite direction of the corner, because it's trying to maintain the vector it had before at a constant speed and direction. You'll also know from the other video about understeer and oversteer, because this center of mass has shifted over to the opposite side of the vehicle to the direction of the corner we would like to travel in, we're going to encounter some difficulty in turning that vehicle to the right, because most of the vehicle's mass is actually pulling us to the left. This is how understeer starts. And conversely, this is now a left turn. We're turning the vehicle to the left. You'll notice that our center of mass has shifted proportionally to the right. This is the exact opposite of the right-hand turn, so if our center of mass moved to the left in a right-hand turn, it is now going to move to the right in a left-hand turn. The same situation applies, the same reason for this applies. What these graphics hopefully have done is to give you some concept of what weight does when it moves around when a car is on track, on the road, in whatever kind of situation. Center of mass, again, that blue dot, will shift around constantly, proportionately to what action the car is doing. If it's at rest, it's going to remain in whatever position it lies in naturally. We have assumed 50-50 for our purposes. If it is going to accelerate, the center of mass is going to move rearward. If the car is going to decelerate, if it's going to brake, it is going to move forward. If we're going to turn right, the center of mass is going to shift left. If we turn left, the center of mass is going to shift right. In any event, however, what does this look like in a sim racing situation, and why is this important when you're out on track? Well, we're going to go into Assetto Corsa and find out. Alright everyone, it is time for the on-track portion of our video today. Here we are at Mugello and we have the Porsche Macan Turbo. Now, why have I chosen an SUV for this demonstration? Well, quite simply, SUVs are bigger than cars for the most part. They also have more suspension travel, they have larger wheels generally, and most importantly, they tend to be heavier, usually by quite a considerable margin. For all of these reasons, SUVs make it a whole lot more easy and more apparent for weight transfer to be visible. So, what we're going to do is drive this thing around with the help of some telemetry aids that I want to take a moment to explain to all of you. Of course, we have our pedal box in the lower left, as you see in a whole bunch of my videos. However, on the right-hand side, you have this rather large SUS telemetry box. What this is the motion rates of the suspension on all four corners. So you can see the four boxes in there. They are located according to their position on the car. So the top left box is the left front wheel, the top right box is the right front wheel, etc. You also see two lines in each box. The red line is the current load value, the current position of the suspension on that corner. The yellow line that you see is the maximum of the extension or compression of the suspension. So that's basically where the bump stop is, if you will. You'll see the red line move up and down as we move through different attitudes, through corners, through acceleration, and through braking, but you should not see that yellow line move. But the boxes are in positions relative to their actual locations on the car where the sensors are on the suspension. So, let's go out on track, and we'll talk a little bit about what we're seeing on that telemetry readout. Alright, so we're doing 100 kilometers per hour, and we are at a pretty constant speed there, just maintaining it a little bit as we head down the rest of the straight here at Mugello. You'll notice that all four boxes there in the telemetry reading, the red lines, are all pretty uniform throughout. We're not seeing too much deviation from where they are reading. That tells us that the car's balance is neutral. The center of mass is where it should be relative to this car's overall setup and configuration, and there's not much dynamic loading happening. However, as we accelerate here, and we're not accelerating very hard, but you're going to see that on the front wheels, there's a bit of a drop as we go into acceleration. That is because of weight transfer. As we talked about before, weight transfer under acceleration means that the center of mass moves rearward. So if we come to a stop here, and we'll just let all of the values zero out once again, we'll accelerate hard and watch the front suspension loadings relative to the rear suspension loadings. You see the loadings there on the front? That red bar goes down relative to the yellow one. However, on the rear, we'll accelerate hard once again. The red bar moves up relative to the yellow one. That is indicative of our weight transfer under acceleration, the center of mass moving rearward. You'll also notice visually that the front end of the car, the nose, rose under acceleration. This is also due to that center of mass shifting. Under braking, once we get into another straight area, we'll demonstrate this. It's not quite as easy to see because the brakes on this vehicle are not that great, but you'll still be able to notice. Brakes. You notice the gap between the yellow and red lines on the rear gets a little bit wider under braking, whereas the gap between the yellow and red lines on the front gets a little bit narrower as the front suspension compresses to accommodate that weight shift forward under braking. So, another time into a braking zone, we brake, the gap rises on the rear, and it closes on the front. Of course, acceleration and braking, as we discussed earlier, they are not the only variables that we have to account for. We have to account for turns. So, left turn, center of mass will shift to the right, and sure enough, we see in a right-hand turn, and we've got another one coming up here, we see that the center of mass will shift over, in a left-hand turn rather, in a left-hand turn you will see the center of mass will shift to the right, and therefore you can see the gap between the yellow and red lines closes on the right rear suspension. It actually almost overlaps. And then when we get into a straight line, everything goes back to being pretty much uniform. We'll maintain a constant speed now, and aside for a few variations in that trace on the red line due to bumps in the road, everything is a uniform gap. Because there's no acceleration, there's no more weight shift. Coming into a braking zone once again, watch the fronts. There's compression, and the rears, they are releasing some tension. So the rears are decompressing and the fronts are compressing. Again, that weight transfer to the front. Into a left-hand corner, watch the right rear. You can see the lines overlap. Right-hand corner, watch the left rear, and you can see the lines overlap again. Visually, just watch the nose dip. There it is. You can see the horizon line tilt a little bit, skewed off to the right side facing down in a left-hand corner, right side facing up in a right-hand corner. So you can see how the sensors work, you can see the data that we're actually looking at as we're going around on track. But weight transfer in practical driving terms, what does this mean? Well, weight transfer is directly proportional to how much the vehicle weighs in the first place. Here, an SUV, it's going to be much heavier than a little sports car, and it's certainly going to be leagues heavier than most racing cars, particularly open-wheeled formula cars that we all love so much. So the amount of weight that a vehicle has at rest or in motion is going to impact your driving significantly. Your acceleration is going to be lower. The heavier your vehicle is, your braking is also going to be diminished proportionally to how heavy your vehicle is. Of course, keeping in that vein, cornering is going to suffer with a heavier vehicle. Basically, everything is going to happen much more slowly with a heavier vehicle than it would with a lighter one. Now, this Porsche is actually very well balanced for what it is. Yes, it is a heavy vehicle. We are running it on street tires, but we have a decently powerful engine, about 400 horsepower. And because it's a Porsche, and they know a thing or two about chassis design, it actually is pretty well balanced for what it is. Is it the fastest thing in the world? It absolutely is not. But I do have to say, for an SUV, it is absolutely wonderful. However, you can see that weight starting to play some difficult parts, if we want to call it that, under braking in the heavy braking zones. You saw how the rear end got light because the weight transferred over to the front axle, and because of that, the rear tires are no longer in quite the same amount of contact with the racing surface as they were before, thus decreasing the amount of overall traction that the rear axle is generating via the tires. What this does, in coupling with the weight transfer over to the front axle, is it creates an unstable situation. The center of mass on the car always wants to pretty much stay in the middle or rearward. Having a rearward center of mass is a little bit more stable, simply because the car naturally wants to rotate more around the rear axle when it's moving forward than it does around the front. However, under braking, we shift that balance forward, the rear end gets light, and things start to become a little unstable. We have that inverted pendulum situation coming to play once again. Also, weight transfer means balance problems. Understeer, oversteer, all of these things are possible to be induced due to weight transfer. You can see there, because we were cornering slightly off camber and slightly downhill, the weight was still largely over the right front, so in a left-hand corner, that induced some understeer. In a right-hand corner, weight's transferring to the left-hand side is pulling us away from the apex, and you can see the understeer occurring there. Same thing through here, through this left-hander, we have understeer, and we have understeer again through the right-hander, so much so that we leave the circuit. So much about trying to drive quickly and cleanly is allowing the car and allowing the suspension time to compensate for that weight transfer. If we're not too aggressive with our steering and throttle inputs, we can give the suspension enough time to compress and decompress so that as that weight shifts around the car, the different components are reacting accordingly and keeping everything under control. Of course, the more tuned your car is, the more specialized your car's purposes are, the less amount of time it takes all of the suspension components and tires to react to weight transfer. For example, the F2004 Formula One car takes fractions of a fraction of a second for the suspension on that thing to react to weight transfer. First of all, the car doesn't weigh a whole lot to begin with, but it is still under the same sorts of loadings that this SUV is. Of course, they are both diminished and magnified at the same time, because although the car is a lot lighter than this, it's also moving a whole lot more quickly. So it has its own problems to deal with, plus there's aerodynamic forces to contend with there. But the same effects are happening. As that car goes into a corner, be it left or right, the weight is going to transfer to the opposite side of the vehicle relative to the direction of travel, and all your suspension components have to react accordingly. Happens a whole lot more quickly because that car is absolutely specialized to go around corners as quickly as possible, whereas this one is more so designed to be a comfortable highway cruiser. But the same forces apply everywhere. So again, just keep an eye on the telemetry boxes for the suspension as we go around corners and see if you can predict where it's going to go, particularly on the rear. Where is that gap between the red and yellow lines going to close as we approach corners? It should be very intuitive by now. Going into a left-hander, is it going to be the left side or the right side that closes up that gap? And of course you can see it is the right side. Time traveling at a constant speed on a very smooth road. You can see there's pretty much no movement anywhere. We put the brakes on, some compression in the front and some decompression in the rear. We return back to rest and everything flatlines, just as you would expect. So that in general is what's going on with weight transfer as you're in a car on track, and also how suspension is going to react to that weight transfer. One thing that does bear mentioning, however, is in our demonstration to begin this video with our diagram, I only showed the center of mass shifting in two directions, and only one direction at one time, fore and aft and left and right. Of course, any combination of those two vectors is possible at any given moment. If you're accelerating through a corner, obviously, the center of mass is going to move rearward, as we discussed, but let's say that corner is a right-hander. Your center of mass is going to move rearward as well as to the left. Again, it depends on how much you're cornering versus how much you're accelerating, but if we were to assume that you're accelerating as hard as you can and cornering as hard as you can in a right-hand corner, we would then expect the center of mass to move to the left rear corner of the car through that situation. So that's really what you're seeing reflected in the suspension readouts. Obviously, you're not seeing one side of the car or one end of the car reacting and the other not reacting because, of course, everything is connected to each other. But generally, you now have an idea of what weight transfer is and a little bit of how it affects the attitude of the car going through. Again, I strongly suggest that you watch the video on control inputs and oversteer and understeer, some earlier videos in this series, so that you can understand this a little bit more in context. What we're going to do next is to have a look at some exterior replays of a hot lap. We're going to use a little bit of slow motion too, I think, just to show you how the car's attitude is changing as it's going around a corner. Okay, so here we are on the replay camera, and you'll be able to see as the car comes into view here, we're heading down the start-finish straight. We've left the pit lane, but we're still going pretty fast. Watch the nose, under braking, little bit of a dip. I'm not quite sure if you could quite see it, but the nose drops under braking, and we go around the corner. You'll also see that there's a little bit of body roll coming into this left-hand corner. Body roll off to the right. I'm not quite sure if you could quite see it there, but you can definitely notice how the attitude of the car changed a little bit laterally as we approach the corner. So if we go into our slow motion here, you can see the car rolls to the right as we turn to the left, and you can see how that reacts across the chassis. Heading into a right-hand corner immediately after this left-hand corner, watch what happens here. We go on the brakes. The nose dips and the car rolls to the left because now we are moving to the right in our direction of travel. You might be able to see the nose dip a little bit more obviously here. There's our nose dip as we apply the brakes heading into the corner. And you can see a roll to the right because we are turning to the left. Similarly here, watch the attitude. Rolling to the left because we're turning to the right. So we can continue at normal speed. Let's watch this in real time. Braking, there's the dip in the nose. Roll to the left as we turn to the right. And the opposite occurs. And it continues all the way through this corner. We level out. Now we brake again, we roll to vehicle left as we turn right, and you'll see that roll continues all the way through this long high-speed corner. Now this area is something that I definitely want to show in better detail. I'm not entirely sure we're going to get the best angle on it, but I intentionally was a bit rough with the steering through this chicane because I wanted to show the speed at which weight transfer can occur. So if you watch the rear end here, we're going to suddenly change direction, and you can see how the car's attitude immediately shifted to the opposite side. We were rolling to the left before, and right now we brake, we throw the car into the left, and the car rolls right. I actually had to throw in a little opposite lock there because the rear end became a little unstable. The center of mass had shifted over the front axle, so we had to accommodate that and compensate for it with some counter-steering techniques. I don't know if there's a better angle that we might be able to see this from. Probably not, unfortunately. Might be able to get a decent view in chase cam, or not. Not so much looking like it. Perhaps we'll be able to see. Using the ground as a reference point, perhaps we'll be able to see how this works. So in slow motion here, watch the front wheels. There's our roll. And you can see how that is working across the car as the weight transfers from side to side as well as from front to rear. Heading into a braking zone once again, the nose will drop. There we go. Car will roll to the left because we're turning right. And now we'll observe a roll reversal. And a roll reversal once again. There it is. Final big braking zone, watch the nose. Drops. Rear end gets a little squirrely because so much weight has transferred to the front end. And a roll to the right as we would expect because we are turning left. So that's basically all she wrote for weight transfer in sim racing. Hopefully this was somewhat informative for all of you guys. And as always, thank you all very, very much for watching.